Thank you for tuning into Trending with the Tribune. I'm your host, Kaliss Stephens, and we will wrap up our interview with Rev Sanders on the issues of HIV and AIDS.
And increasingly, we've discovered that there are biomedical responses that help in terms of stemming the spread of the disease. There's a whole dynamic now called pre-exposure prophylaxis, which is called PrEP. And some of the drugs now that are most effective as retroviral drugs, we've discovered that if people who are particularly vulnerable, if you have what's called a seroconcordant couple, if one of the persons is positive and the other is negative, there's a way in which if they take PrEP on a daily basis, it creates a situation where the likelihood of transmission between them is absolutely, pretty much null and void. They just don't end up being in a posture. If you can get your viral load, that's the way in which you measure the degree to which the disease is present in your body. If you can get the viral load suppression to a point where it's what we call undetectable, you will still have the virus somewhere in your body. It's just undetectable. But we do know that people who can come to be undetectable, they can have intimate relations with their partners and loved ones and not transmit the disease. And if you know you're in a relationship with a person who has the disease, if you both take it, that means that even the person who is negative, as well as the person who's possible, have created. And we still tell people it's wise to use the traditional precautions in terms of condom use and safe sex, practices. But there's a way in which we know now it's a disease that you can live with. So it's interesting because now we're up to right at 20 years since the retroviral drugs have come on the scene.
So would you say the numbers are going down as far as deaths since the medications have gotten stronger and people can live longer?
Yeah, morbidity, death rates have gone down, but it's interesting. They have not gone down at the same rates for all people. So in the African American community, we're still seeing that the rates of death as relates to the disease are probably at a kind of a plateau, but still there's still some slight increase. The thing that's even more, I think, of concern is the fact that it appears that the rates of infection are continuing to climb at a faster rate for people who are being, most disproportionately impacted, and that ends up in many instances being amongst African Americans, or people of color in many instances around the world, but especially with what we refer to as MSM, young gay black men. There is a level of susceptibility, but that has to do with the same issues that it's always had to do with, because when people are fearful and reluctant to deal forthrightly with who they are, closeted behavior, that's a thing that they use in the community of people who deal with addiction. There's a little line they use that says secrets kill. Secrets can kill you, and there's a way in which secreted, closeted behavior probably lends itself to greater vulnerability. But what we're trying to do is to try to create a mindset and an attitude and a disposition within the faith community that does not continue to condemn and not continue to dehumanize and not continue to belittle and dismiss people on the basis of this disease. Because we do know that the faith community is still a place where everybody in our culture tend to gravitate towards. And so the messaging has to be right. We have to make sure that those who are the messengers have the right message. Misinformation, is deadly. And in too many instances, people still have unfounded fears and unfounded, kinds of worry as relates to this disease. There are a lot of ways that if you allow yourself to be properly equipped in terms of your knowledge base and in terms of your behavior, you can avoid this disease. But let me back up and tell you one other thing about the church that was significant, all right? I always have to give credit um, to a little woman who created an organization called the Balm in Gilead. And many years ago, she just decided that one of the things she was going to do was try to just get preachers to pray. I think it was divinely inspired, because there's a way in which people who disagree with you very often will pray with you about something. And what she was able to do was to begin to get pastors and preachers and churches and communities of faith to agree to have what was referred to as a week of prayer for the healing of AIDS. When she started it, she referred to it, I guess, it was only in Harlem in New York, so they call it the Harlem Week of Prayer. Then it grew to be the Black Church Week of Prayer. Now it's evolved to what they refer to as the National Week of Prayer for the healing of AIDS, because it does transcend racial lines on that level. But one of the things that happened with that is that, at least in terms of the level of consciousness, awareness, a level of having accurate information. So the first week in March, they do that every year. I say it had a tremendous effect. I think that statistically, sometimes people will, question or argue the degree to which that's true, but I would say it had a tremendous effect because people would come together and pray, even when they disagreed about a lot of things. So we've had the experience here in our congregation. We do every week, every first week in March, we do activities during the week. But our signature event is called Praying Through the Night, where we have a 12-hour prayer vigil. But what we found is that we can get pastors and we can get people from congregations who still wrestle, with issues of sexuality in religious terms, but they're still willing to come and be a part. They're still willing to pray. So you have to be able to achieve the inroads of engagement in any way that you can find them. And I think for that reason, it's changed. So now there are congregations around who would never have said they had anything to do with ministry related to HIV, and still, in some instances, don't deal with what I would think of as being some of the core issues and some of the most significant issues. But the issue of sexuality, I think you have to appreciate in the church, is that, it's not just about homosexuality and saying gender-loving people. The fact is, we don't deal with issues of sexuality, period, in the church. Exactly. So consequently, in many instances, children who grew up in churches, across racial lines, end up being just as susceptible, just as vulnerable as anybody else, because it was not dealt with in an honest, forthright manner, and not woven into the fabric of their understanding of their faith. Yeah.
I'm glad that you're mentioning that, church-going people are no different than people that don't go to church. Yes. So I like that you pinpointed that. Another question I wanted to ask you was, I know that you travel a lot. You go to conventions, conferences, and talk about this this issue. Where's your next stop?
Oh God, my next stop, I guess, I just came back from St. Louis, Missouri. I guess my next stop is going to be in Atlanta, and then after Atlanta, it'll be Seattle, Washington, and after Seattle, it'll be, I'm not sure. I depend on my assistant to keep up with it, but I travel usually every week. God is blessed in order to give us the opportunity to be able to carry our message of hope and the initiative of trying to develop capacity within the faith community to deal with this disease. And so I travel constantly, in the country and out of the country. We do significant ministry in South Africa. I think I've probably been in South Africa 5 times in the last 18 months or so. We go back and forth to do that. And then, but it's interesting, in South Africa, one of the things we're doing is working on the same kind of initiative we're working on here. And let me tell you how that works. In many instances, there ends up being a kind of stratification or a kind of dichotomy that people use in terms of who's doing what within the HIV/AIDS community. I'm one of those folks that's very insistent upon the fact that it's one fabric, and that all of us who are doing the work have to figure out how to do it together, especially on the level of biomedical research, because in some instances, those who are doing the research will say, well, the science is the science, and it doesn't have to do with the psychosocial issues. It does not have to do with the spiritual issues of that. But we have come to a point now where many in the scientific community are very much cognizant of the fact and accepting of the fact that these are things you have to do. So I spend a lot of my time working with biomedical researchers. One of the things I do is for the Vaccine Trial Network, the HIV Vaccine Trial Network, which is the vehicle by which the major research in the world is being done to stem the spread of the disease. And I serve as a co-chair of the working group and chair of the advisory committee for that group, which ends up being one of the reasons why I travel in and out of the country a lot, because about 12 of the sites here in the United States, and many of the rest of them are in other parts of the world, and especially in sub-Saharan Africa. So and what I do is the same thing I do here. It's work with clergy to help to develop the relationships, to help to develop the rapport, help to develop the knowledge base that allows there to be a healthy interaction between people who are doing the science and people who are interacting with the people on a level that's probably more personal and represents a greater avenue for engagement than anybody else. But if, in too many instances, those dynamics end up being at odds with each other. And I have tried very hard to spend my ministry helping to address that. There are some cities here in the United States, we've had some major programs focused on trying to do that. We spent a lot of time working on an initiative like this up in Rochester, New York. There's another that we spend a lot of time dealing with out in Oakland, California. But there are other communities where we spend a lot of time as well, in Chicago and Columbia, South Carolina, in New York. I've been involved in the initiative that they have in New York to end AIDS as they know it in the state of New York by 2020. It's only 3 years away, but I usually go to New York every other month at least, 6-7 times a year to different areas. Usually do regional stuff, do more stuff in Rochester. But the idea, and this is the point I'm making, is that the idea is that it has to be a coordinated effort. There has to be a way in which there's a respect for people who are doing the psychosocial side, and people who are doing the spiritual side, and people who are doing the medical research side. Because if you developed a vaccine tomorrow and had it available to folks, one of the things you would probably find out is that there'd be a reluctance to take it, because there's a lot of distrust. There's been, historically, many instances of abuse in terms of how experimentation has been carried out in our communities, which were not necessarily as respectful as they are these days in terms of the persons who are being invited into the research projects. So there's a lot of distrust, a lot of fear. You think always people, when you say that, the instant they think of the experience of what happened in Tuskegee years ago in terms of syphilis research. But the fact is there's some other examples around the world. But when you start talking about methods and modalities of treatment that involve anything that's invasive, then there's a way in which people get to be kind of hypersensitive to the idea of being involved. So I spent a lot of time to do that. But one of the things that I've been able to do is, and this is another example for me, and I say this in no way to, I'll just say, well, it's like this. If you look at my resume, one of the things you'll see is that the last 3 presidents, I was blessed to be able to be appointed by all 3 of them in order to do things in relationship to HIV and AIDS. During President Clinton's administration, he was gracious enough to appoint me to the CDC advisory board around HIV and AIDS. And during the Bush administration, I served on the President's advisory, which happens to be one of the great accomplishments of that. I always say if President Bush has no other legacy that anybody wants to celebrate, it will be the founding of PEPFAR, which is the major vehicle by which HIV/AIDS is being addressed globally. But I was on his advisory committee when that occurred. And then during President Obama's years, I was blessed to be able to be a part of the people who developed the National Strategic Plan. But also during that time, I got appointed to the PEPFAR Scientific Advisory Board. Now, it's real interesting. Of course, we have a 4th president now, and I still serve on the PEPFAR Advisory Board. I wasn't appointed by this president, but I also have not been relieved of my duties by this president either. But I'm excited about the fact that, the reason why I tell you that is this: if you're dealing with the issues in ways that are focused primarily on the human condition and the things that can make a difference in terms of the livelihood and the quality of life for folks, then hopefully that means that you'll end up being able to get the benefit of people seeing you in terms of the work as relates to hope and healing and health and and the like, and help. Because there's a way in which it doesn't make any difference at a certain point when persons are dealing with those situations, which clearly are life-threatening and have adverse impact upon the quality of life. If you can do something to improve the quality of life and make that the point of what drives you, then I think you find yourself being able to cut through some of the other stuff. I still am concerned with the fact that so much of what gets in the way has become so institutionalized and so systemic and so structural, especially the issues of racism. There's a reason why there are people of color who end up being most disproportionately impacted, not just in the southern United States, but in the global South. If you go with the equatorial world, all around the equator, there's a way in which you'll find that people who are of darker complexion, who've been blessed with this ebony glow, which we share. There's a way in which you find out there seems to be some reason why the vulnerability is greater, but I think it's because the resource, and the commitment, the sensitivity, and the concern in relationship to people of color ends up being different. And so I'm not a person who bites my tongue, on that level, and I will continue to speak as forcefully as I can to suggest that you have to ultimately deal with, I call the real germ and the real cancer and the real disease that's killing us is the disease of racism and the disease of sexism and the disease of classism and the diseases of homophobia and Islamophobia and all the things that end up being, the ways in which we categorize people and pigeonhole people and dismiss them on the basis of some aspect of their personhood. In Metropolitan Church, we have a little saying, this is our calling. Our calling says that Metropolitan Interdenominational Church is a community of believers, inclusive of all and alienating to none, leading the way to spiritual growth by sharing God's love with the world. That's our mantra. That's what we say all the time. And HIV ends up being one of the ways in which it's become most important for us to express it.
That's awesome. That's real awesome. Well, that's all the time we have.
Okay.
But is there any social media or a website that you can tell our viewers how we can keep up with you, how we can keep up with the topic of HIV and AIDS? You could just say it right to our viewers. Sure.
All right. Well, I would encourage you to, if you just Google Metropolitan Interdenominational Church, it'll give you a reference to the website. We're probably still in the business of turning that website into being as effective as it can be, but that's one of the ways that's probably most effective. But also, I guess if you go to social media and just put YouTube, if you go to YouTube and put my name in, you'll probably find a lot of the talks and a lot of the speeches that I do around the country and around the world. But that's it, yeah.
All right, well, thank you so much for your time, Reverend Sanders.
Thank you.
And that's all for Trending with the Tribune. You guys have a good one.